The invitation arrived wrapped in black velvet, the kind of quiet luxury that whispers power before a single word is read. And the moment Naomi Carter touched the envelope, she understood something dangerous was waiting inside. The card was thick, the kind used by families who measure legacy in generations rather than dollars. And as she slid it free beneath the warm light of her Manhattan apartment, the gold lettering caught the evening glow like a blade. Adrian Whitmore and Vanessa Hale request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration. The words felt colder than winter glass. But it was the photograph tucked beneath the card that made Naomi's breath pause. It showed the Whitmore estate glowing beneath 1,000 lights, crystal chandeliers blazing through the tall windows, a sweeping marble staircase wrapped in white roses. Her house, the one that had once carried her last name on every deed and document before Adrian took it with the kind of quiet precision that leaves no fingerprints. Beneath the image, a handwritten message curved across the bottom in ink that looked almost playful. Hope you still remember the view. Naomi stared at the words for a long moment, while the city hummed outside her floor-to-ceiling windows, taxis sliding through the avenues, and the Hudson reflecting the fading gold of a late autumn sunset. Once, that house had stood on a hill overlooking the river, a $100 million landmark of old New York architecture built from pale limestone and patience. It had been the first thing Adrian Whitmore ever said he loved about her. Not her name, not her intelligence, not the quiet dignity that made strangers turn their heads when she entered a room, but that house, the Carter estate. She placed the card slowly on the marble kitchen counter and let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. For a moment the past tried to return like a memory that still believed it had permission to stay. The long charity galas, the candlelit dinners, the laughter drifting through the glass halls of a home that once felt indestructible. Back when Adrian Whitmore had stood beside her on the terrace and promised they would build a life inside those walls that no storm could ever touch. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, and the illusion faded as easily as fog lifting from the river. The house was no longer hers. The man who had once called her his future now planned to marry someone else beneath its chandeliers. And he had invited her to watch. The quiet click of the front door echoed through the apartment before Naomi realized her mother had returned. Evelyn Carter stepped inside with the calm composure that had always defined her presence, her silver-streaked hair catching the soft hallway light like brushed steel. She set her gloves on the table and noticed the black velvet envelope. Almost immediately, Evelyn did not rush to pick it up. She never rushed anything. Instead, she studied Naomi with the kind of steady attention that had carried their family through more storms than anyone outside the Carter name would ever know. Naomi slid the card across the counter without speaking. Evelyn read it once, her expression barely shifting, then turned the photograph toward the window where the last sunlight fell across the image of the mansion. For several seconds the room held only silence and the distant murmur of the city below. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm but edged with disbelief. He took the house, and now he wants me sitting in the front row while he marries her inside it. Evelyn placed the card down with careful precision. You're going, she said. Naomi looked up sharply, certain she had misheard. I'm not stepping into that place again just to become their entertainment. Evelyn's gaze remained steady, almost thoughtful, the way it always did when she was several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Yes, you are, she replied quietly. Naomi shook her head, a small bitter laugh escaping before she could stop it. After everything he did, you want me to watch him celebrate. Evelyn walked toward the window and looked out over the darkening skyline where the first lights of evening were beginning to appear. No, she said after a moment. I want you there because that night isn't really about their wedding. Naomi frowned slightly, sensing something beneath the calm tone in her mother's voice. Evelyn turned back toward her daughter, and for the first time since entering the room a faint, knowing smile touched the corner of her lips. That night, she said softly, is when the truth finally walks back into that house. The next morning arrived with the quiet gray light of early winter stretching across Manhattan. The kind of light that turns glass towers pale silver and makes the Hudson look like brushed steel. And Naomi Carter stood alone beside the wide kitchen window, holding a cup of untouched coffee, while the invitation from the night before rested on the marble counter like an artifact from another life. She had not slept much, not because the card had shocked her, but because it had reopened a chapter she had spent months teaching herself to close. The Carter estate had never simply been a beautiful building or a symbol of wealth. It had been the center of a family story that stretched back almost a century, long before Adrian Whitmore had ever appeared in her life with his polished confidence and quiet ambition. The house stood on nearly 3 acres overlooking the river just north of Manhattan, a rare stretch of land where the city skyline softened into old trees and wide lawns. And Naomi could still remember being 10 years old, racing her bicycle along the curved stone driveway while her father watched from the veranda with a cup of black coffee and the morning newspaper folded under his arm. The limestone walls had held generations of laughter, quiet conversations, holiday dinners that stretched late into winter nights while snow gathered outside the tall windows. It was the kind of home that carried memory in its architecture, every hallway echoing with a past that refused to disappear. When Naomi first introduced Adrian Whitmore to her parents almost 8 years earlier, he had stood in the grand foyer looking upward at the crystal chandelier with the expression of a man seeing the future unfold in front of him. And he had said something that made everyone laugh at the time, something that sounded charming rather than ambitious. He said that a house like this did not just belong to a family, it belonged to history. Naomi had believed him then, believed that he admired the legacy rather than the power attached to it. Adrian had been different from the other men in their social circle, younger, sharper, someone who had built his first company before turning 30 and whose reputation in New York business circles carried a mix of admiration and caution. He spoke about vision the way artists spoke about color, about building companies that would last longer than headlines and markets. And Naomi, who had grown up surrounded by quiet wealth but little arrogance, had been drawn to the idea that someone so driven could still look at her with genuine warmth. The early years of their relationship had unfolded like a careful balance between two worlds, his fast-moving corporate empire and her quieter work managing the Carter Cultural Foundation that supported museums, community art programs, and restoration projects across the city. Their evenings often ended on the terrace of the estate overlooking the river lights, Adrian leaning against the railing with a glass of mineral water while Naomi described new projects she wanted the foundation to fund. He always listened carefully, always nodded with that thoughtful smile that made people feel understood. If anyone had asked Naomi back then what love looked like, she would have described something steady rather than dramatic. Something that felt like standing on a balcony watching the city move while knowing the ground beneath you would not shift. The wedding had been small by Manhattan standards. Only 200 guests gathered in the gardens behind the house beneath white lanterns strung between the old maple trees. Naomi remembered the way Adrian had held her hand during the vows, his voice calm and certain when he promised they would build a life together that honored both of their families. Evelyn Carter had watched quietly from the front row that afternoon, her expression thoughtful rather than sentimental, as if she already understood something the others did not. The first few years of marriage passed with the easy rhythm of two ambitious people sharing the same horizon, charity events in the winter, business travel in the spring, quiet weekends when the estate felt almost peaceful enough to forget the pace of the city only 20 miles away. Yet even in those early days, small details had begun to shift in ways Naomi did not immediately recognize, subtle changes that only made sense much later. Adrian spent longer hours in Manhattan offices. His meetings grew more private, and the conversations about the Carter estate slowly changed tone. He began asking careful questions about the trust structure attached to the property, about the legal agreements her father had created before his death, questions that sounded practical at first but gradually became more focused, more persistent. Naomi had answered without suspicion because she believed that a marriage meant sharing responsibility for everything they owned together. What she did not realize at the time was that Adrian Whitmore had never looked at the Carter estate the way she had seen it, as a home filled with family memory. He had always looked at it the way he looked at every opportunity in his life, as something that could eventually belong to him. The shift did not happen all at once because ambition rarely announces itself as betrayal when it first enters a room. It begins as a conversation, as a suggestion delivered in a calm voice across a dinner table illuminated by candlelight and polished silver. Naomi remembered one evening during the third year of their marriage when the autumn wind had moved through the tall maple trees behind the Carter estate, and the sound of leaves brushing the stone terrace had filled the quiet space between them while they finished dinner. Adrian sat across from her in a navy suit that still carried the sharp lines of a day spent in Manhattan boardrooms, his expression thoughtful as he studied the architectural plans spread neatly across the table. He had just returned from a meeting with investors, and the energy of opportunity seemed to follow him into the house like a second presence. He told Naomi that New York was changing faster than anyone expected, and that properties like the Carter estate were becoming more valuable every year, not just because of their beauty, but because land that close to the city skyline had become almost impossible to find. Naomi listened politely, while sipping sparkling water, assuming the conversation was simply another reflection of his constant awareness of business trends. Adrian had always spoken about growth the way other people spoke about the weather, as something inevitable and natural. He leaned forward slightly that evening and traced a careful finger along the edge of the blueprint where the property boundaries were marked in fine black lines. 3 acres overlooking the Hudson River, he said quietly. A place like this could anchor an entire cultural district if someone had the vision to develop it correctly. Naomi laughed gently at the idea, because the Carter estate had never been considered a project or a strategy. It had simply been home. She reminded him that the property was protected by a family trust created decades earlier, and that the intention of the estate had always been preservation rather than transformation. Adrian nodded with that same calm smile he used in every negotiation. The smile that suggested patience rather than disagreement. Of course, he said, history deserves respect, but history also survives because people adapt to the future. Naomi did not argue further because the conversation felt harmless, just another evening discussion between two people who approached the world from different directions. The following months brought more of those conversations, always polite, always reasonable, always framed as curiosity about how the Carter Trust operated and what would happen to the estate decades from now when Naomi and Adrian were older. He asked about legal structures, inheritance language, and the trustees who oversaw the property documents that Naomi had rarely examined closely herself because her father had trusted a respected New York firm to manage the details. Adrian never sounded impatient when she admitted she did not know every answer. Instead, he offered to help review the documents together so that they could understand the estate as a shared responsibility rather than something that existed only in her family name. Naomi believed the offer came from partnership rather than calculation because marriage had taught her to see collaboration as a sign of loyalty. Meanwhile, life in Manhattan continued with the quiet rhythm of privilege and obligation that defined their social circle. Charity galas filled the winter calendar. Adrian expanded his companies with acquisitions that appeared regularly in financial newspapers, and Naomi devoted her energy to restoring art programs in public schools across the city through the Carter Foundation. Their appearances together still attracted admiration because they seemed balanced in a way that rare couples sometimes achieve, his ambition complemented by her calm sense of purpose. Yet beneath the surface, the conversations about the estate continued to grow more precise. Adrian began introducing Naomi to attorneys who specialized in property law and estate planning, presenting each meeting as an opportunity to strengthen the protection surrounding the Carter legacy. The language used during those meetings sounded responsible and practical, filled with terms like restructuring, modernizing trust agreements, and ensuring long-term stability for future generations. Naomi signed several documents during that period, believing she was participating in the natural maintenance of a complex family asset. She trusted the process because Adrian sat beside her during every conversation with the quiet assurance of someone who understood legal strategy better than she ever intended. 2. What Naomi did not realize during those months was that each document shifted the architecture of control a little further away from her and a little closer to Adrian Whitmore. The changes were subtle enough to avoid alarm and gradual enough to appear routine. By the time Naomi noticed that the estate no longer appeared in the foundation reports the way it once had, the legal structure surrounding the property had already begun to answer to a different name. The first time Naomi Carter realized something was wrong did not come from a dramatic confrontation or a sudden revelation. It arrived quietly on a Tuesday afternoon while she was reviewing financial reports for the Carter Cultural Foundation inside a sunlit office overlooking Fifth Avenue. The foundation had always maintained meticulous records of every asset connected to the Carter family legacy, including the estate overlooking the Hudson River, and Naomi had reviewed those reports dozens of times throughout the years without noticing anything unusual. Yet that afternoon a small detail caught her attention in a way it never had before. The Carter estate was no longer listed beneath the primary asset column connected to the family trust. Instead, the property appeared within a separate legal structure managed through a holding company Naomi did not immediately recognize. At first, she assumed the change was simply the result of the legal restructuring Adrian had mentioned months earlier during those long discussions about modernization and protection. However, the unfamiliar company name made her pause long enough to request the updated legal documents from the foundation accountants. While she waited, she walked to the tall window beside her desk and watched traffic moving slowly along the avenue below, yellow taxis weaving through late afternoon shadows as Manhattan continued its restless rhythm. Naomi told herself there was a reasonable explanation waiting in the paperwork because Adrian had always spoken with such calm certainty when discussing financial strategy that questioning him had rarely seemed necessary. Still, a quiet unease settled into her thoughts as she remembered how carefully those documents had been presented to her during the meetings with attorneys. The language had been dense with legal terminology and reassuring phrases about long-term stability. Naomi had trusted the process because trust had always been the foundation of their marriage. An hour later, the email from the accountants arrived with several attached files containing the updated trust agreements and corporate ownership structures connected to the property. Naomi opened the documents slowly and began reading each line with the careful attention she normally reserved for foundation grants. The explanation did not appear immediately, but the deeper she read, the clearer the pattern became. The Carter estate was now technically controlled by a corporate entity created less than 6 months earlier, an entity whose primary executive authority belonged not to the Carter Trust, but to Adrian Whitmore. Naomi felt the first true chill of understanding move through her chest. The transfer had not happened through a single dramatic sale or a visible legal battle. It had unfolded through a sequence of strategic adjustments embedded within the paperwork she had signed during those meetings about modernization. Each signature had quietly shifted control until the structure of ownership had changed entirely. Naomi closed the documents and sat very still while the late afternoon sunlight moved slowly across her desk. She remembered the evening Adrian had encouraged her to sign the final set of revisions, explaining that the updated structure would allow them to protect the estate from future tax complications and ensure that the foundation could benefit from the property for decades. He had spoken with the calm authority of someone guiding a responsible decision rather than someone gaining an advantage. Naomi had believed him without hesitation because betrayal had never seemed like a language Adrian Whitmore understood. Later that evening, she returned to the apartment they once shared in Manhattan and found Adrian standing beside the living room windows, speaking quietly into his phone while the skyline glowed behind him. He ended the call when she entered and greeted her with the same composed warmth he always carried after a long business day. Naomi placed the printed documents on the glass table between them and asked a simple question that seemed to change the air in the room. Why does the Carter estate now belong to your holding company? Adrian studied the papers briefly before looking up at her with an expression that was not defensive but almost analytical, as if he were evaluating a business proposal rather than responding to his wife. The structure is temporary, he explained calmly. It allows me to manage the property more efficiently while we reposition the assets. Naomi listened carefully, searching his face for the reassurance she expected to find, but something in his tone had shifted from partnership to authority. When she asked why the change had not been explained more clearly before the documents were signed, Adrian simply leaned back against the window frame and folded his hands with a quiet patience that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Naomi, he said gently, every major decision requires someone willing to lead. Sometimes leadership means making adjustments that others might not immediately understand. The words settled into the room like a final statement rather than the beginning of a conversation. And for the first time since their marriage began, Naomi Carter understood that the house overlooking the Hudson River no longer belonged to the family that built it. The silence that followed Adrian Whitmore's words did not feel like the end of an argument because Naomi Carter had never raised her voice in the first place. Instead, it felt like the quiet moment when a door closes somewhere deep inside a house, and you realize the hallway beyond it no longer belongs to you. The Manhattan skyline shimmered through the tall windows behind Adrian, while the evening lights of the city began to rise like distant constellations across the horizon. Naomi stood near the glass table with the legal documents resting beneath her hand and studied the man she had married as if seeing him for the first time. Adrian looked exactly the same as he always had, calm, composed, the kind of man whose confidence filled a room without effort. Yet the familiarity she once trusted now felt carefully constructed, as if every reassuring smile and thoughtful pause had been part of a long strategy unfolding quietly across the years. Naomi finally spoke with the same measured tone she used during foundation board meetings when difficult decisions had to be faced without emotion. You said the estate would always remain part of my family trust. Adrian tilted his head slightly, as though considering the phrasing of her memory rather than the meaning behind it. What I said, he replied evenly, was that the estate would remain protected, and that is exactly what I have ensured. Naomi looked down at the documents again, where the corporate structure listed Adrian Whitmore as the primary executive authority of the holding company, now controlling the property overlooking the Hudson River. Protection had become ownership through a series of signatures she had trusted him to explain honestly. The realization did not arrive with anger, but with a slow clarity that moved through her thoughts like cold air through an open window. She understood now that Adrian had never rushed the process because he did not need to. Patience had always been his most valuable asset. When Naomi lifted her eyes again, Adrian had already walked toward the sideboard where a crystal decanter reflected the lights of the city beyond the glass walls. He poured a small measure of mineral water into a tall glass and offered one to her with the same polite courtesy he used when greeting investors at corporate events. Naomi did not take it. Instead, she asked the question that seemed impossible only hours earlier. Does the house still belong to me in any legal sense? Adrian did not answer immediately. He studied the skyline for a moment, as though considering the scale of the city rather than the weight of her words. Technically, the property now operates under my management structure, he said calmly, but that does not change the fact that you will always have access to it. The statement carried the careful tone of someone offering a generous compromise. Naomi almost smiled at the precision of his language because access was not the same as ownership, and Adrian Whitmore knew that better than anyone in New York finance. The quiet elegance of his explanation revealed more truth than any argument could have. Naomi felt something inside her settle into place. Not heartbreak, but understanding. She walked slowly toward the window where the night had fully taken hold of the skyline, and the river beyond the city reflected a ribbon of scattered lights. For years that view had represented stability, the feeling that her life rested on foundations built long before she was born. Now it revealed something else entirely. The foundation had never disappeared. It had simply been moved somewhere she had not thought to look. Behind her, Adrian continued speaking with the composed patience of a man, explaining a complicated strategy to someone who would eventually appreciate the outcome. He spoke about long-term vision, about opportunities the estate could unlock under the right management, about the importance of leadership in preserving assets across generations. Naomi listened quietly, because every sentence confirmed what the documents had already shown her. Adrian Whitmore had never intended to share control of the Carter estate. Only the illusion of partnership until the moment ownership shifted beyond question. When he finished speaking, the room returned to silence except for the distant sound of traffic moving along the avenues below. Naomi turned from the window and looked directly at him. Her expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, the way it had always appeared during the most complicated foundation negotiations. If the house belongs to you now, she said quietly, then I suppose the rest of the world will see it that way as well. Adrian nodded slightly, confident that the matter had reached its logical conclusion. What he did not notice was the faint change in Naomi Carter's gaze, the subtle steadiness that replaces disbelief once truth becomes undeniable. Because in that moment Naomi understood something Adrian Whitmore had overlooked throughout his careful plan. A house may change owners on paper, but legacy rarely moves so easily. The following morning, Naomi Carter did something that surprised even herself because instead of calling attorneys or confronting Adrian Whitmore again, she packed a single suitcase and left the Manhattan apartment before the city had fully awakened. The early winter air carried the sharp clarity that arrives just before sunrise when the streets feel almost peaceful despite belonging to one of the busiest cities in the world. A black car waited at the curb outside the building, but Naomi waved it away and chose to walk the first few blocks alone, while the sky slowly shifted from steel gray to pale gold above the skyscrapers. She moved through familiar avenues that once felt like the center of her life, yet now seemed strangely distant, as if the rhythm of the city had continued forward while she had quietly stepped aside. By the time she reached the small private terminal at Teterboro Airport, the sun had risen above the skyline and cast long reflections across the Hudson River. The short flight north took less than 40 minutes, yet it felt like crossing an invisible boundary between two different versions of her life. When the car finally turned onto the narrow road that led toward the Carter estate, Naomi could already see the distant silhouette of the house rising above the winter trees like a memory that refused to fade. The limestone walls still caught the morning light exactly the way they had when she was a child racing bicycles down the curved driveway. Nothing about the structure itself had changed, yet the feeling surrounding it had shifted in a way she could not fully explain. Naomi stepped out of the car, near the tall iron gate that marked the entrance to the property, and studied the familiar landscape in complete silence. Frost covered the grass across the 3-acre lawn, and the river beyond the trees shimmered beneath a thin layer of mist. Once the gates had opened automatically when her car approached because the security system recognized her access code. Now the metal bars remained closed. The small detail carried more meaning than any legal document Adrian Whitmore had shown her the night before. Naomi stood there for a moment watching the house that had once carried her family name before turning back toward the waiting driver and asking him to take her somewhere else instead. An hour later, she stepped through the quiet doorway of a townhouse on the Upper East Side where Evelyn Carter had lived for nearly 20 years. The interior of the house carried the calm order of someone who valued patience over display. Sunlight moved across polished wood floors while shelves filled with carefully organized books lined the walls. Evelyn sat beside the window reading a newspaper when Naomi entered, and she looked up with the same steady expression she had worn the night before when the black velvet invitation appeared on the kitchen counter. Naomi placed her suitcase near the door and walked slowly into the room without speaking. Evelyn folded the newspaper and set it aside as if she had been expecting this moment to arrive sooner or later. "You went back to see it," she said quietly. Naomi nodded once before sitting across from her mother. "The gates are locked now," she replied calmly. For a brief second, something like recognition moved through Evelyn Carter's eyes, but her voice remained measured when she answered. "Gates have a habit of locking when someone forgets who holds the original key." Naomi studied her mother carefully because the sentence carried a deeper meaning than its quiet tone suggested. The Carter estate had always been surrounded by layers of history that extended far beyond the physical building itself. Naomi had grown up hearing stories about the family's early years in New York, when her grandfather built the foundation of their legacy through careful investments and patient partnerships, rather than sudden ambition. Yet throughout all those stories, Evelyn had rarely spoken about the legal structures protecting the estate, except to say that the property had been secured long before Naomi ever signed a document with Adrian Whitmore. Naomi leaned forward slightly and asked the question that had followed her all morning. "If the house truly belongs to him now, then why do you still sound certain it will not remain that way?" Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked across the room toward a small antique cabinet standing near the far wall and opened a drawer that had remained closed for years. Inside rested a narrow wooden box polished smooth by time. Evelyn lifted it carefully and placed it on the table between them before meeting Naomi's gaze again with a calm that felt almost reassuring. "Because," she said softly, "Adrian Whitmore may control the house on paper, but paper does not always tell the whole story." Naomi Carter looked at the small wooden box resting between her and her mother as the late morning light slipped quietly through the tall windows of the Upper East Side townhouse. And for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The box itself was simple, carved from dark walnut with the kind of careful craftsmanship that belonged to another era when objects were built to last longer than the people who owned them. Naomi had never seen it before, yet something about the way Evelyn Carter placed her hand gently on its lid suggested it had waited a very long time to be opened. Outside, the distant hum of Manhattan traffic drifted through the quiet street. But inside the room the atmosphere carried the calm gravity of a conversation that had been postponed for years. Naomi leaned forward slightly, studying her mother with the focused attention she once used during board meetings when every word mattered. "You kept that hidden all this time," she said softly. Evelyn's expression did not change, yet the faint curve of her mouth hinted at a patience Naomi had inherited without realizing it. "Some things are not hidden," she replied quietly. "They are simply not needed until the moment arrives." She lifted the lid of the box and turned it toward Naomi. Inside lay several neatly folded documents tied together with a narrow ribbon that had faded slightly with age, along with a small brass key that caught the light like a quiet signal. Naomi did not reach for them immediately because the presence of the key alone seemed to carry meaning beyond ordinary explanation. Evelyn gently untied the ribbon and unfolded the first document, sliding it across the polished table. The paper was thick, older than the legal agreements Naomi had signed with Adrian Whitmore months earlier, and the handwriting across the signature line belonged to a generation long before either of them. "Your grandfather drafted this trust nearly 50 years ago," Evelyn said calmly, "back when the Carter estate was still considered one of the last untouched properties along that stretch of the Hudson River." Naomi studied the lines carefully while her mother continued speaking in the steady voice of someone explaining a story that had been waiting to be told. "The trust was designed to protect the estate not only from outside buyers, but also from internal mistakes," Evelyn explained, "because your grandfather believed that power can change people in ways they do not notice until it is too late." Naomi looked up at her mother with quiet concentration. "Are you saying the house cannot actually be transferred the way Adrian arranged it?" Evelyn shook her head slightly, the movement precise and deliberate. "Legally, the structure Adrian created allows him to manage the estate for now," she said. "But management and ownership are not the same thing under the original Carter Trust." Naomi felt the first spark of something unfamiliar move through her thoughts. Not hope exactly, but recognition. She turned the document toward the window where sunlight illuminated the detailed clauses written decades earlier in careful legal language. The trust contained a final provision that had never been activated because until recently no one had attempted to remove the estate from the Carter lineage through manipulation or coercion. Evelyn rested her hand lightly beside the paper and pointed to a single paragraph halfway down the page. "If control of the estate is obtained through deceptive restructuring of the trust, the property automatically reverts to the primary Carter heir upon public legal challenge," she read quietly. Naomi sat back slowly while the meaning of the sentence settled into place. Adrian Whitmore believed he had captured the house through strategy and patience. Yet the very mechanism he used had triggered the safeguard your grandfather anticipated long before Adrian was even born. Naomi glanced again at the small brass key lying inside the box. "What does the key open?" she asked. Evelyn allowed herself a faint smile that carried the calm confidence Naomi remembered from childhood, whenever a difficult problem had a solution waiting just beneath the surface. "The key belongs to a locked study inside the estate library," she said softly. "A room Adrian Whitmore never knew existed because the entrance is hidden behind the old mahogany shelves your grandfather installed before the house was finished. Inside that study are the original trust ledgers, the signed architectural plans, and the sealed documents proving the estate has never legally left Carter ownership." Naomi's gaze lifted slowly from the box to her mother's face as the final realization began to take shape. Adrian Whitmore believed the gates of the estate had closed behind Naomi forever, but in truth he had only stepped into a house whose history he never understood. Naomi Carter remained seated at the table for several minutes after her mother finished speaking, her fingers resting lightly beside the brass key, while the meaning of everything she had just heard slowly settled into place. The quiet room seemed different now, not because anything around her had changed, but because the story she believed about the Carter estate had finally revealed a deeper layer beneath it. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon light shifted across the Upper East Side. Streets, while distant traffic carried the steady rhythm of Manhattan life, continuing exactly as it always had. Yet inside Naomi's thoughts, something had quietly realigned itself. Adrian Whitmore believed the estate belonged to him because the documents he controlled said so. And in the world he understood, documents usually decided everything. But Naomi Carter had grown up inside a family that understood legacy in a different way. The Carter name had never depended solely on signatures or legal structures. It had survived because each generation prepared the next to protect what mattered when the moment arrived. Naomi lifted the key from the wooden box and studied the way its worn brass surface reflected the soft sunlight, imagining the hidden study Evelyn had described behind the mahogany shelves of the estate library. She had spent her entire childhood wandering through that house, yet she had never noticed any doorway concealed within the long wall of books. The idea that an entire room had remained hidden inside the estate all these years made the past feel suddenly alive again, as if her grandfather's careful planning had been quietly waiting for this exact situation to unfold. Naomi placed the key gently back into the box and looked across the table at her mother. "Adrian thinks the estate is his now," she said calmly, "and from his perspective, he has already won." Evelyn Carter allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile before closing the lid of the wooden box. "That is the advantage of patience," she replied softly. "Sometimes the person who believes they have won simply does not realize the story has not finished yet." Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair, letting the calm certainty in her mother's voice guide her thoughts forward rather than backward. For the first time since the confrontation in the Manhattan apartment, she felt no urge to argue with Adrian or demand explanations. His strategy had already revealed exactly how he viewed the world, and that understanding made the next steps unexpectedly clear. Instead of rushing into a legal challenge, Naomi would allow Adrian Whitmore to continue believing the estate was firmly under his control. She would let him move forward with the plans he had already begun, including the elaborate wedding celebration scheduled to take place inside the very house he thought he had taken from her family. Naomi stood slowly and walked toward the window while the late afternoon sun reflected across the glass towers rising above the city. If the truth hidden inside the Carter Trust was going to be revealed, it would need to happen at the moment when Adrian felt most certain of his victory. She turned back toward her mother with a quiet steadiness in her expression. "The invitation he sent was not meant to humiliate me," she said thoughtfully. "It was meant to prove that the house belongs to him now." Evelyn nodded slightly because she understood exactly where Naomi's thoughts were leading. Then perhaps the best place for the truth to appear is exactly where he plans to celebrate that belief. Naomi felt the faint outline of a plan forming with the same clarity that once guided her decisions at the Carter Cultural Foundation. The wedding Adrian intended to host inside the estate would gather investors, business partners, and social figures from across New York, all standing beneath the chandeliers of the Carter Library where the hidden study remained concealed behind the mahogany shelves. Naomi imagined the moment those shelves would open to reveal the original trust ledgers and the documents proving the estate had never legally left Carter ownership. The image carried a quiet sense of balance rather than revenge. She did not need Adrian Whitmore to feel humiliation or regret. The truth itself would be enough. Naomi returned to the table and lifted the wooden box carefully before closing it with both hands. "Then I will go to the wedding," she said calmly, "because if Adrian Whitmore wants the entire world to see that house as his victory, then that is exactly where the Carter story should finally be told." The days leading to the wedding passed with a strange calm that surprised Naomi Carter because the storm she once expected to feel inside her never arrived. Instead, there was only a quiet focus guiding every step she took, as if some invisible compass had finally aligned with the direction her family history had always intended. Manhattan moved through its usual rhythm around her, while winter settled gradually across the city. Storefront lights glowing earlier each evening in the Hudson River, reflecting the pale gray sky like polished steel. Yet Naomi felt detached from the noise of it all. Her thoughts centered instead on the estate that waited 20 miles north where Adrian Whitmore continued preparing the celebration he believed would confirm his victory. News of the upcoming wedding had already begun circulating across New York social circles because Adrian Whitmore rarely did anything quietly. The event was described as a private ceremony, but the guest list suggested something closer to a strategic gathering of influence. Investors from his technology holdings, partners from international development firms, media executives, art patrons, and several of the city's most recognizable philanthropists had all received invitations. To most of them, the event represented the union of two powerful figures and the unveiling of Adrian's newest symbol of success. To Naomi, it represented something else entirely. She spent the week reviewing the original Carter Trust documents. With the same careful attention she once applied to cultural foundation proposals, studying every clause written decades earlier by her grandfather until the language felt as familiar as her own handwriting. Each sentence confirmed what Evelyn Carter had already explained, that the estate had never legally left Carter ownership, and that the safeguard hidden within the trust would activate the moment the deception behind Adrian's restructuring was publicly challenged. Naomi did not rush the process because the truth carried more power when presented with patience rather than emotion. One evening, she visited a small law office on Madison Avenue where a longtime Carter family attorney named Harold Bennett reviewed the documents with quiet interest. Harold had worked with Naomi's grandfather many years earlier, and his calm presence carried the confidence of someone who understood the difference between temporary control and permanent ownership. When Naomi explained Adrian Whitmore's strategy, Harold listened without interruption before leaning back slightly in his chair and adjusting his glasses. The law can be manipulated in many ways, he said thoughtfully, but trust law written half a century ago by cautious people tends to be very difficult to escape. He examined the original clause once more and nodded slowly. If the documents inside that hidden study are exactly what your mother believes they are, the estate remains legally yours, and the moment the evidence is presented, Adrian Whitmore's entire structure collapses. Naomi thanked him and left the office without further discussion because the legal confirmation changed nothing about the plan already forming in her mind. The truth would not arrive in a quiet courtroom months from now, but inside the Carter estate itself, at the precise moment. Adrian believed the world was celebrating his control of it. The night before the ceremony, Naomi stood once again inside her mother's townhouse, while the city lights glowed through the tall windows, and Evelyn Carter prepared tea at the small kitchen counter. The wooden box rested between them as it had since the day Naomi first learned the truth about the hidden study. Naomi lifted the brass key and turned it slowly in her fingers while imagining the moment the mahogany shelves would open. Inside the estate library, Adrian Whitmore had built his success on timing and calculated appearances, believing every room he entered belonged to him the moment he crossed the threshold. Tomorrow he would welcome hundreds of guests into the Carter estate, believing the house represented his triumph. Naomi closed her hand around the key and felt a quiet steadiness settle into place. This time the room would belong to history rather than strategy. Evelyn placed a warm cup of tea in front of her daughter and studied her expression carefully. "Are you certain you are ready for what happens tomorrow?" she asked softly. Naomi looked toward the window where the skyline of Manhattan stretched into the dark winter sky and allowed herself a small calm smile. "Adrian Whitmore invited me to watch him celebrate inside my own home," she said quietly. "So tomorrow I will simply remind him whose story that house was always built to tell." The morning of the wedding arrived with a cold clarity that made the sky above the Hudson River look almost transparent, and as the first lights spread across the hills surrounding the Carter estate, the limestone walls of the house glowed softly, as though the building itself understood the weight of the day unfolding within it. Luxury cars moved steadily along the curved driveway while attendants guided guests toward the wide front entrance where tall arrangements of white roses and winter greenery framed the doors Adrian Whitmore had ordered polished for the occasion. Inside the house, the atmosphere carried the refined energy of a celebration carefully designed to impress. Crystal chandeliers blazing above polished marble floors while soft music drifted through the hallways, and the scent of fresh flowers mixed with the quiet murmur of conversation from guests who had traveled across the country to witness the union of one of New York's most ambitious businessmen with the elegant Vanessa Hale. Adrian Whitmore stood near the grand staircase, greeting investors and partners with the calm authority that had built his reputation across corporate circles. his tailored charcoal suit perfectly fitted, his voice warm yet controlled as he spoke about the future with the same confidence he used in every boardroom negotiation. To those gathered inside the Carter estate, this wedding symbolized the arrival of a new era, a moment when Adrian Whitmore would publicly establish his place among the city's most influential figures while celebrating inside the magnificent property he now controlled. Vanessa Hale moved gracefully among the guests, wearing a white gown that reflected the chandelier light like a quiet constellation. Her smile composed and radiant as she accepted compliments from socialites and media figures who admired both her elegance and the strategic alliance her marriage appeared to represent. Beyond the formal hallways, the estate library remained closed for the ceremony, its tall mahogany shelves standing quietly behind polished doors while the hidden study behind them remained unknown to everyone except two people who understood the deeper history of the house. Nearly 20 miles away, Naomi Carter stepped from a black car as it stopped at the entrance gate of the estate just as the afternoon sunlight began to fade toward evening. The iron gate stood open now because the celebration had drawn too many guests for security to question every arrival. Naomi paused for a moment beside the driveway, her eyes moving slowly across the familiar landscape where frost still clung to the grass beneath the winter trees. She wore a dark blue dress that carried the quiet elegance of someone who did not need attention in order to command presence. And in her hand, she carried a small leather clutch where the brass key rested beside the folded Carter Trust documents Harold Bennett had prepared for the evening. The distant sound of laughter drifted from the open terrace where guests admired the view of the river and spoke about Adrian Whitmore's remarkable rise in the business world. Naomi walked toward the entrance with calm, measured steps, her posture steady as she crossed the threshold of the house that had once been her childhood home. Inside the foyer, the chandeliers illuminated the marble floor exactly as they had during countless family gatherings years earlier. Yet now the space belonged to strangers who believed they were witnessing the beginning of Adrian Whitmore's newest triumph. A few guests recognized Naomi immediately, and their quiet conversations faltered as she passed, curiosity spreading through the room like a ripple across still water because many of them remembered the rumors surrounding Adrian's divorce and the property transfer that followed. Naomi acknowledged them with a calm nod before moving deeper into the house where the ceremony was about to begin. Across the room, Adrian Whitmore noticed her arrival and paused mid-conversation, his expression shifting only slightly before returning to the composed confidence that had guided every step of his career. He walked toward her with the smooth assurance of a man welcoming an expected guest rather than confronting a complicated history. "Naomi," he said evenly when he reached her, "I was not certain you would accept the invitation." Naomi met his gaze without hesitation while the murmur of guests continued around them. "You wanted me here," she replied quietly. "So it seemed appropriate to see how the evening unfolds." Adrian studied her for a moment, perhaps searching for signs of resentment or regret. Yet her calm presence revealed nothing beyond quiet certainty. He gestured toward the main hall where the ceremony would soon begin beneath the glowing chandeliers. "Then enjoy the celebration," he said politely, "because tonight marks the beginning of something important." Naomi glanced briefly toward the closed doors of the estate library, where the hidden study waited behind the mahogany shelves before returning her gaze to Adrian Whitmore. "Yes," she answered softly, "tonight certainly does mark a beginning." The ceremony began just after sunset when the last traces of winter light faded beyond the tall windows of the Carter estate, and the chandeliers inside the grand hall glowed brighter against the darkening sky outside. Guests gradually moved toward the central room, where rows of white chairs had been arranged across the polished marble floor, while a soft quartet played near the far wall beneath towering arrangements of roses and winter branches. The atmosphere carried the polished elegance of a celebration designed for photographs and headlines, and quiet conversations drifted through the hall as influential guests settled into their seats, expecting to witness the final moment of Adrian Whitmore's carefully crafted triumph. Naomi Carter stood near the edge of the room, observing the scene with calm attention, while the brass key rested quietly inside the leather clutch at her side. From her position, she could see the tall doors leading to the estate library where the mahogany shelves concealed the hidden study that had remained untouched for decades. Every detail inside the house felt familiar yet distant, as if the building itself had been waiting patiently for the moment when its true story would return. Across the room, Adrian Whitmore stood beside Vanessa Hale, near the small platform prepared for the ceremony, greeting the final arriving guests with the effortless confidence that had defined his public life. He appeared entirely at ease beneath the crystal lights, speaking warmly with business partners and investors who had traveled from across the country to witness the event. To them, the evening represented the culmination of Adrian's ambition, a symbolic declaration that his influence now extended beyond boardrooms into the rare world of historic New York estates. Vanessa moved beside him with poised elegance, her white gown reflecting the chandelier light, while she accepted congratulations from guests who admired both her composure and the strategic alliance her marriage appeared to represent. Naomi noticed that Adrian glanced toward her occasionally throughout the evening, not with hostility, but with a curious awareness, as though he were still trying to determine whether her calm presence meant acceptance or something else entirely. When the music softened and the officiant stepped forward to begin the ceremony, the room gradually fell silent except for the quiet rustle of silk and the distant sound of the river wind moving beyond the estate walls. Adrian took Vanessa's hand and guided her toward the center of the platform, while guests leaned forward with quiet anticipation. Naomi watched them for a moment before turning slowly toward the library doors. No one stopped her as she crossed the hall, because most of the guests believed she was simply leaving the room rather than stepping toward the part of the house that held the truth Adrian Whitmore had never discovered. Inside the library, the lighting was softer and the air carried the faint scent of old books and polished wood that Naomi remembered from childhood afternoons spent reading beside the tall windows overlooking the river. The mahogany shelves rose nearly to the ceiling exactly as they had for decades, filled with carefully arranged volumes that concealed the narrow seam her grandfather designed long ago. Naomi walked along the shelves until she reached the place where the wood grain shifted almost imperceptibly beneath the dim light. She opened her clutch and removed the brass key, feeling its familiar weight settle into her hand. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes and imagined her grandfather standing in this room years earlier, designing the quiet safeguard that now rested in her palm. Then she inserted the key into the small brass plate hidden between the shelves and turned it slowly until a soft click echoed through the silent library. The tall section of mahogany moved almost invisibly, revealing a narrow doorway behind the books that opened into a small private study untouched by time. Inside the room, a polished desk stood beneath a shaded lamp, and several sealed ledgers rested within a glass cabinet exactly where Evelyn Carter had said they would be. Naomi stepped inside and lifted the original trust documents from the cabinet with steady hands before returning to the library. Moments later, the distant sound of applause drifted through the hallway as the ceremony reached the exchange of vows. Naomi walked back toward the grand hall carrying the documents that proved the Carter estate had never legally left her family's ownership. When she entered the room again, the guests turned toward her in quiet confusion, while Adrian Whitmore paused mid-sentence beside the officiant. Naomi moved forward with calm certainty until she stood where every guest could see her clearly beneath the chandelier light. Adrian watched her approach with an expression that slowly shifted from polite curiosity to something far more uncertain as she placed the original Carter Trust documents on the ceremonial table beside him and spoke in a voice that carried across the silent hall. "I believe this house would like to remind everyone who truly owns it." The silence that followed Naomi Carter's words settled across the grand hall, like the sudden stillness before a storm. And beneath the brilliance of the crystal chandeliers, every conversation in the room faded into complete attention. Adrian Whitmore remained standing beside the ceremonial table where the original Carter Trust documents now rested, his confident posture unchanged at first, as though he believed Naomi's interruption was simply an emotional gesture rather than something capable of altering the outcome of the evening. Vanessa Hale looked from Adrian to Naomi with a polite but puzzled smile, clearly assuming the moment would pass as quickly as it had begun. Yet the guests surrounding them sensed the shift in atmosphere immediately, because the calm certainty in Naomi's voice carried none of the hesitation they expected from someone confronting the man who controlled the estate. Naomi rested her hand lightly on the documents while her eyes moved slowly across the room, acknowledging the investors, journalists, and social figures who had gathered believing they were witnessing a wedding celebration. Many of them recognized the Carter name, and the quiet curiosity spreading through the hall reflected the awareness that something far more significant than a personal dispute had just entered the room. Adrian finally glanced down at the documents and then back toward Naomi, the faintest trace of skepticism appearing in his expression. "Naomi," he said calmly, "this is hardly the moment for a legal discussion." Naomi's gaze remained steady as she replied in the same composed tone she once used while presenting foundation initiatives before crowded auditoriums. "You are correct," she said softly, "which is why this will not take long." She opened the first document and turned it so the officiant and several nearby guests could clearly see the signature line dated nearly 50 years earlier. "This is the original Carter family trust," she continued, "written when the estate was first placed under legal protection to ensure it would remain within the Carter lineage for generations." Adrian watched her carefully now, the earlier ease in his posture beginning to fade as the significance of the moment became impossible to ignore. Naomi lifted the page slightly and allowed the chandelier light to illuminate the final clause her grandfather had written decades earlier. "According to this provision," she explained, "if control of the estate is transferred through deceptive restructuring of the trust, the property automatically reverts to the primary Carter heir upon public legal challenge supported by the original documents." A quiet ripple of murmurs spread through the audience as several attorneys and investors leaned forward to examine the text more closely. Adrian's expression remained composed, but his silence carried a new tension as he recognized the language Naomi was reading aloud. Naomi placed the document back on the table and gently opened the leather folder Harold Bennett had prepared earlier that week. Inside rested certified copies confirming the existence of the hidden trust clause and the sealed ledgers from the study behind the library shelves. These records remained secured inside the estate itself for decades, she said calmly, waiting for the moment when the trust might need to defend the property against exactly the situation that has occurred. Vanessa glanced toward Adrian with visible confusion now, while several guests exchanged uneasy looks as the implications of Naomi's explanation began to settle across the room. Adrian stepped forward slowly and examined the documents more closely, his sharp attention scanning each page with the precision of a man who had spent his life understanding complex contracts. For the first time that evening, he did not speak immediately. Naomi watched him quietly, not with anger, but with the calm patience that comes when the truth no longer needs persuasion. Finally, Adrian lifted his gaze and looked directly at her, the confident certainty that had defined his presence earlier replaced by a measured awareness that the foundation beneath his victory had begun to shift. "Naomi Carter," he said carefully, "are you suggesting the estate has never legally left your family's ownership?" Naomi met his eyes beneath the chandelier light and allowed the faintest smile to appear. "I am not suggesting it, Adrian," she replied gently. "I am simply reminding everyone that some houses remember exactly who they belong to." For a long moment, no one inside the Carter estate moved because the quiet certainty in Naomi Carter's voice had transformed the grand hall from a place of celebration into a room filled with careful attention. The chandeliers continued to glow above the marble floor, while the soft music that had played earlier faded into silence. And every guest present seemed to understand that the evening had shifted into something far more significant than a wedding ceremony. Adrian Whitmore remained standing beside the table where the Carter Trust documents lay open beneath the crystal light, his eyes scanning the pages again as though searching for a detail he had somehow overlooked during months of meticulous planning. He had built his career on understanding leverage and legal strategy. Yet the language written decades earlier in Naomi's grandfather's hand carried a precision that even his experience could not easily dismiss. Around the room, several guests who worked in finance and law leaned forward to study the documents more closely, their quiet murmurs confirming that the clause Naomi described was not merely symbolic, but legally binding. Vanessa Hale watched the exchange with growing confusion, her earlier composure replaced by the unmistakable awareness that the house surrounding them might not belong to Adrian Whitmore after all. Naomi stood calmly beside the table with the quiet poise of someone who had already accepted whatever outcome the truth would bring. She did not raise her voice or demand recognition because the moment no longer required persuasion. The documents spoke clearly enough on their own. After several seconds, Adrian slowly closed the folder and placed his hand lightly on the polished surface of the table. The confidence that had filled his expression earlier now replaced by thoughtful restraint. He looked toward Naomi with the same analytical attention he once used during their earliest conversations about business and legacy. It appears acknowledgement of a truth that had been waiting many years to return. Across the hall, the officiant stepped back respectfully, while several guests began whispering to one another as the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. The estate that Adrian Whitmore believed he had secured through strategy was still legally protected by the Carter Trust, and the presence of the original ledgers removed any uncertainty about its ownership. Vanessa looked toward Adrian again as if expecting him to correct the misunderstanding. Yet he remained silent for a moment longer before turning his attention back to Naomi. "You could have challenged this privately months ago," he said carefully, rather than allowing it to unfold here tonight. Naomi considered the question briefly before answering. "Perhaps," she said, "but this house has always represented more than a legal asset. It represents the history of the Carter family, and history deserves to be remembered in the place where it was built." The guests listened closely as she spoke because her words carried none of the bitterness they expected from someone who had just confronted the man who attempted to claim her inheritance. Instead, her calm presence transformed the moment into something quieter and more reflective. Adrian finally nodded once in acknowledgement, recognizing that the foundation beneath his plans had shifted beyond recovery. The celebration he had designed to confirm his triumph now revealed something entirely different. He stepped back from the table and addressed the room with the composed authority that had always defined him. "It appears tonight's ceremony must be postponed while certain legal matters are clarified," he said with controlled dignity. The announcement moved through the hall like a soft wave as guests began exchanging thoughtful glances, aware they had just witnessed a rare moment when ambition collided with legacy. Naomi closed the leather folder and held it gently against her side, before turning toward the tall windows overlooking the river. Outside, the winter sky stretched quietly above the dark water, the same view her family had watched for generations. The Carter estate had not changed hands after all. It had simply waited for the right moment to remind the world whose story it had always belonged to. And as Naomi Carter stood beneath the chandeliers of her family home, she understood that some victories arrive not through conflict, but through the quiet strength of truth returning exactly where it was meant to stand.